So welcome to this session at WSIS Plus 15 Forum. And it's going to be on promoting rural broadband access through partnerships and policy reform. We'll just give ourselves another minute and then we'll start. Okay. So once again, we would like to welcome and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the panelists and to the participants who are joining us today. I just wanted to mention that that during the session, we'll be recording the session and participants' microphones are muted. You will be able to take questions during the Q&A, but feel free to drop your questions into the chat during the the conversation and presentation moves on. And once we are done with all the discussions, we will definitely pick it up and pick up the questions and try to answer them. So thank you again for joining us, and we will be starting now. So today's session is on promoting rural broadband access through partnerships and policy reform. And as you all know, half of the world is offline. And this percentage is significantly higher now because of COVID-19. We also know that 14% of rural areas have access compared to 42% of urban areas. And again, during COVID, we've seen this number amplified because the areas where people would typically be connected, such as workplaces, libraries, cafes, tend to be closed during lockdown. And therefore, a lot more people tend to see themselves offline. Again, we also noticed that for rural populations, while COVID is also a matter of concern, we also note that connectivity is one lifeline that they are often denied because of the nature of either the terrain or lack of investment or so many other issues which are peculiar to rural areas. Rural populations do not have the options that urban populations have. And therefore, if we are serious about achieving universal access by 2030, we need to speed up progress. That's why the various organizations on this panel, that's ourselves, Alliance for Affordable Internet, APC, the Digital Empowerment Foundation, CIPESA, and Facebook came together to develop this Rural Broadband Policy Framework. Indeed, this framework was developed towards the end of last year, and it was launched in February this year. But that was before we saw the onslaught of COVID. And now with COVID, we've seen a higher sense of urgency about improving connectivity, not just for urban areas, but for rural areas as well. So just a little bit about the panel that we have. My name is Elena Sapong. I'm the Deputy Director and Policy Lead for the Alliance for Affordable Internet. We are the broadest coalition of technology, public sector, private sector, civil society, trying to drive down the cost of broadband through policy and regulatory reform. We are an initiative of the World Wide Web Foundation, which was set up by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who founded the World Wide Web. And together with me on this panel, we have Mike Johnson, who is with the Association of Progressive Communications. Mike is the Internet Access Specialist with the APC. He's assisted in the establishment of internet-based communications in over 40 countries. We also have Lillian Nawalga. Lillian is with CIPESA. The long name for CIPESA is the Collaboration on International ICT Center Policy in East and Southern Africa, I beg your pardon. But CIPESA is a short form. And Lillian is got over 10 years of ICT policy research and advocacy experience under her belt. She works with CIPESA, and CIPESA is a CSO that focuses on decision-making that facilitates the use of ICT in the support of development and poverty reduction. We also have the Osama Manzar, who is the founder and director of the Digital Empowerment Foundation, which is based in India. It's a Delhi-based not-for-profit working to find solutions to bridge the digital divide. And they are doing some wonderful work, which we'll see as we move towards the end of this discussion. And then finally, I have my colleague, Natalia Fordish. Natalia is a senior policy and regulatory specialist at the Alliance for Affordable Internet. She's a licensed attorney and has worked on technology and communications policy and regulatory issues for over 12 years. She's very well versed in this industry, and she's based in Brazil. So I believe I have everyone covered now. I also have my able-bodied colleague, Michael Nagakaki, who is in the background helping us with our presentation and the slides as well. So without much ado, I'm going to pass it on to Natalia, who's going to set the stage for what the Rural Broadband Policy Framework is, and then we'll see how we can apply it in real life. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you for all the panelists. Thank you for everyone involved in organizing this session, and for whoever is watching us right now. I think the first thing to highlight on the framework is the fact that it's a collective effort. And it's a collective effort that came from the realization that it was really necessary to create a comprehensive framework for broadband connection in rural areas, since what we had so far, I mean, we have a lot of documents and frameworks, but it was still necessary to condense everything together, recommendations. With COVID-19, we see that, you know, it has become much more clear that the gap exists in different ways. So for example, an OECD policy note that it's upcoming, it's gonna highlight, for example, how remote working in rural areas, the gap is much wider, right? And also it's important to have connection, for example, for sending back and forth information to cities, regards to, you know, health and safety and so on. And this is supposed to be a one-stop shop for rural broadband connectivity. It has high-level recommendations, and we are also developing a policy playbook that will have recommendations that are more precise and specific to each of the things we highlight. And it is also a live document, so we're still constantly developing it. It has 6 criteria that any policy in any country needs to, oh, sorry, the next one, yeah, sorry. It has 6 criteria that any policy in any country must satisfy in order to become successful. One relates to broadband, the high quality, affordable broadband services in underserved rural areas. This means, for example, among other things, that rural populations deserve the same level of quality than urban services. Rural broadband policies should draw from real-world experience locally, regionally, and globally. It's important to make sure that local contexts are taken into consideration, but also it's important to pay attention to approaches that have already been tested and embrace innovation and be open to trial. Rural broadband policies should harness the resources and capabilities of the private sector and complementary providers, such as community networks. It's great to see that a lot of work recently at A4AI and other institutions are highlighting the importance of community networks, right, in different countries. We need appropriate incentives for eliminating, for example, unnecessary impediments to investments in these areas. We need regulations that are technology neutral. We need to be able to leverage these self-organized community networks through a more enabling regulatory environment. And also spectrum policies are important to support these networks. Rural broadband policies should be comprehensive. This means that they also should focus on the affordability of the services. They should have participatory and consultative processes. They should be open to testing of new business models and innovations. Rural broadband policies must be gender responsive. It's really hard to find sex disaggregated data, for example. So we should have efforts to make sure that we are able to gather this sex disaggregated data. And well, countries should recognize that the gender gap exists, and this gap might be even more exacerbated in rural communities. We need effective implementation. We require evidence and standards. So, I mean, again, sex disaggregated data availability is an example, but also data collection processes that should be in place to allow, for example, for future evaluations of the policies. Also, I encourage everyone to look at the meaningful connectivity standard that A4A has recently launched, because this is an example of measurable target that should be included in the policy. For example, in this document that I will just briefly mention, we talk about getting the right speed, having an appropriate device, connecting with enough data, using internet regularly. So this specific measures should be in the policy. And I encourage you to take a look at our website to look for the meaningful connectivity standards that we have recently launched. So the next slide, please. I think I will pass this one because I won't have time to cover this all. So the elements of the Rural Broadband Policy Framework that we have developed, as I said, we will have later on, we'll also develop a policy playbook, but this high-level recommendations include A, harnessing market competition while addressing market failures. Among other things, this means, for example, encouraging infrastructure sharing at the wholesale level. This ultimately facilitates greater competition in the retail level. We have countries, for example, such as Mexico and Rwanda, doing this through public-private partnerships. Universal service and access funds can also be used to allow for these shared wholesale models. B, streamlining regulatory processes. This means, for example, eliminating policies that are no longer necessary, including space for innovations, creating a supportive environment for rural operations. I'm sure that my colleagues in the panel will also address this in a few minutes. But regulations governing market entry in rural areas, all these things. C, public access and universal service and access funds. Well, it's also important that we employ public access facilities as community institutions to ensure broader socioeconomic impact. It's important to, in some places like Brazil, for example, we have funds that have existed for many, many years and have accumulated a lot of resources, but cannot be applied for broadband, only for fixed telephony, for example. So we should also ensure that funds operate under non-discriminatory conditions, and that they are transparent and accountable in applying open data principles. D, effective managing spectrum resources. We know that a lot of times we need to make an effort to unlock spectrum to meet, for example, the ITU recommendations, which most regions are not fully unlocking all the spectrum they could, right? Applying special and more flexible rules in rural areas for spectrum, enabling and licensed use of spectrum in additional bands. So not only the bands that already are have some unlicensed parts, making sure that spectrum is available on a technology neutral basis, for example, encouraging appropriate conditions for spectrum sharing. For example, many countries have already started using TV white spaces to provide connectivity in rural areas. The E, leveraging innovative technologies, architectures, and business models, promoting the free flow of information and allowing operators to operate with flexibility. But this means also that no blocking, throttling, filtering, or other means of limitations should exist. So again, I can not highlight enough how important it is to make sure that it's clear that rural populations should have the same level of service than urban areas. And lastly, the three last things are the appropriate tax and fee structure, eliminating taxes in many cases. Again, Brazil is an example of a country that has high taxes for the sector. And rural areas, we should pay attention to understand to what extent the prices in of services in rural areas are affected by this tax structure. Stimulating demand for broadband services. The policies should also make sure that they have a component of demand incentives and digital literacy, for example, which might have wider gaps in rural areas, facilitating local content development in different languages and And then lastly, monitoring and having accountability for the policy. This assuring that, you know, accountability and monitoring is in place leads to a successful implementation and allows for policies like this to continue in place. Well, I'm ending my presentation. Next, yeah. So my colleagues will also talk about what we are doing in terms of seminars, workshops, and I encourage everyone to check our website. Next slide, please. We are going to be uploading new resources soon for policymakers, civil society. So I encourage everyone to check our website and check the framework itself, and also the new contents that are going to be uploaded soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia. That was really useful. I hope others found it very useful as well. As Natalia has mentioned, this is a living document. Those 8 elements that she mentioned could have actually been broken down further if you look into the framework itself. And as we said, the framework is applicable in various ways. That's why we've got our partners here who are going to speak to the issues and also some of the elements and how they're applying it in real life. So I'll start off with Osama Manzar from the Digital Empowerment Foundation. I know that they've been working extensively in many areas, particularly on community networks, and we've seen how this framework can be brought to light in the work that they do. So Osama, we'll be very happy to hear from you how DEF is applying aspects of this framework to its work.
Thanks, Eleanor, and thank you very much for everybody who has joined. Rural broadband is a huge responsibility on the world. I think, you know, when we say that 50% of the world is yet to be connected and not connected, we are presuming that most of those people who are not connected live in rural areas or remote areas. What we have learned in India, considering that significant number of those unconnected people live in India, if 3.5 billion people who are not connected, and considering India's population is 1.3+ billion, I'm sure at least, you know, 1/3 of them live in India, you know, who are unconnected. So it's very significant that how India is performing on, you know, connectivity, and especially rural broadband connectivity. I want to actually also, you know, focus on the myth of, you know, India is always said to be very well connected as far as the mobile connectivity is concerned, you know, because India is also one of the highest mobile connected country. And TRAI, which is the Telecom Regulatory Association of Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, claims that we have more than 1 billion, you know, connectivity, which actually is not correct, because, you know, it's not a unique connectivity, because it's like a scenario of one person owns 4 SIM card, you know, so they are counted as 4 connectivity, which is not true. So urban, of course, has got 400% connectivity, while rural has got less than 1/4 of the connectivity percentage. What is very interesting is that India's connectivity, especially in rural areas, suffer from 2 things. One is that this is not deeply connected, and the second is not qualitatively connected. When I say qualitatively, it's not broadband. It's not the functionally oriented, transaction-oriented connectivity. You know, our maximum connectivity in rural areas is touch and go. You know, it's like 2G, it's non-functional 3G, or it's very narrow. I would say it's a narrow band. It's not a broad band. And therefore, since Eleanor, you also indicated that COVID has actually exposed our connectivity or our dependency on digital so much that now the real transactional connectivity is required. We really need to transact audio, video, we need to transact e-commerce, we need to, not only just send messages, but we also need to transact with the doctors or medical services. So when you are actually secluded or isolated, you are so much dependent on digital, it requires high bandwidth, it requires quality connectivity and also sustained connectivity. And that actually exposes the whole thing. And here also, for example, since COVID, education is shut down. Medical services are shut down because, people are not moving and content is not reaching to them, messages are not reaching to them, transactions are not reaching to them. And therefore, there is a huge problem going on. Coming to how a Digital Empowerment Foundation has worked so far, I mean, for us, scenario doesn't change because the rural connectivity was poor earlier also, it's poor now also. Earlier, we had alternative that if you are not connected, then you can walk around, you can go somewhere where there is a connectivity. But at the moment, at the time of COVID, you really need connectivity to do all your work. Here, at least 3 things has been seen that to be done very well. One is that I'm glad that our framework includes high responsibility of private sector to have the pervasiveness of broadband. And here the Geo network, the Reliance Geo network has significantly increased the area of coverage as far as the rural connectivity is concerned. So which is a very good thing. But the other things like creating, liberalization of ISP, where the small people or the small entrepreneurs or the, small companies can also flourish, that hasn't been done in practicality. White space is not available. TV white space is not available. It's not allowed. So at the end of it, when you want to do remote connectivity, you have to depend a lot on what ISP license allows. And also what are the unlicensed spectrum that is available to be exploited. So what we have seen is that, India has one program called CSC program, which is the Digital Entrepreneurship Program. And they claim that almost close to 300,000 entrepreneurs are spread all over the country in rural areas. And they have been now under their company, which is government managed, is allowed to become an ISP, or they are allowed to buy connectivity from the government provided and distribute it. It has not really started. Government claims that out of the village councils of 250,000, only 100,000 locations have been fibered optic connected, but it's almost non-functional. Less than 20% are broadly functional. But the good thing is that it has been decided that they should be considered as open to any local entrepreneur to buy the connectivity and distribute locally. And then I will come to privately or independently community networks. We perhaps must be one of the largest number of community network operators in the country and in the region, because Mike knows many of those connectivity that we have done in rural areas. But even though we have hundreds of such community networks that we have done, which is using unlicensed spectrum and using currently ISP provided, backend backhaul, we have not been able to scale up to the level of entrepreneurship-based community networks, because initially it requires a little deeper infrastructure, which must be provided either on the USO fund or provided by the private sector or under CSR and so on and so forth. So even though community network has been in practice in India, and I'm sure F4AI knows through APC and many other community networks operator and how it has been propagated all over the world, we haven't been able to convert it into a out of the box solution that anybody can just buy it or take it and start doing the connectivity. It still depends on a lot of passion. It depends a lot of techno nerdism. It also depends a lot on initial investment on base infrastructure, and then gradually depend on sustainability. So what is very important in our framework that we have created with A4AI, and what we need to propagate is that, you know, we do not need to depend on 2030 to reach the rest of the 50% connectivity, because 2030 is still 10 years later. You know, it is very important that how we see that the rural population do not suffer because of the lack of connectivity or because of the lack of quality connectivity in the next couple of years, because as the COVID is going to exist here, you know, it's going to affect our life. There will be less movement, there will be less travel, there will be more and more dependency on quality broadband connectivity in rural areas. So is there a possibility that this framework actually increases or pressurizes to create community-based, you know, organization to adopt community networks at a larger number, and which is also adopted by the government and the private sector? Unfortunately, most of the government and private sector do not see community networks as a viable, you know, and pervasive and multiplier model. You know, this is very, very important. Like in India, I've seen that many of the places where we have gone connectivity and started buying the backhaul, you know, the backhaul service provider actually discourages giving the backhaul, you know, because they know that you are going to give the connectivity in the area where they would like to provide the same connectivity on a higher commercial value, but they can't get it at the moment. So they are waiting for the market to actually get converted. You know, so the learning from here in India is that, yes, we need to very heavily go on unlicensed spectrum to use. We need to go on creating entrepreneurship model for usage of backhaul and ISP to create community networks. And it's very, very important to also, through advocacy, pressurize government that the village council level connectivity that they were supposed to provide is done faster and then converted into entrepreneurship model. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Osama. That was so insightful. You know, for me, the three key takeaways is the importance of partnership. As you mentioned, you talked about some of the resistance you're facing with even getting backhaul. So definitely partnership between private sector and public sector is going to be very crucial. You also talked about the quality that we need. We need to look at making sure that we have quality, sustained, affordable connectivity, which is what we have put in our meaningful connectivity standard. So again, I encourage everyone to check out what's the connectivity standard, the meaningful connectivity standard, and see how it's applicable in your places of work. And then finally, you talked about the need to look at the entrepreneurship model. And I think that the framework sets a really good stage for understanding how complementary networks can also support the rural connectivity you know, sector as well. So this is a very good way of setting the stage and how this has been applied in Asia. I'm very keen to see how this is, how different this is or how similar this is in Latin America. So Mike, I know you've worked extensively in various parts of the world, particularly in Latin America. I'm really keen to hear how this has been applied as well, and which aspects of the framework you found very useful or continue to find useful.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. For those of you who don't know the APC, we're a membership-based organization with about 50 members, primarily in the Global South. And a few years ago, we noticed that an increasing number of our members were getting frustrated with the lack of progression in terms of bringing people online in rural areas, and also the high cost of connectivity through metered broadband that took place, that is currently still in place in most urban areas in developing countries. A4I has pioneered their affordability analysis, which has now been adopted by the Broadband Commission, where we would like to see broadband connections costing less than 2% of monthly gross national income. And in fact, we're still very far away from that. Some countries in Africa, the average person must pay as much as 20% of their monthly income for a very basic 1 gigabit per month package. So interestingly enough, we were able to get some support from the Canadian government to do a global study in 2018 to try and understand better what was happening in terms of these new complementary alternatives to the traditional commercial or national broadband rollout plans. And so we traveled the world looking at this, and I'd like to give you a couple of examples from Latin America, which informed our inputs into the rural broadband strategy that's been developed now. So to give you an example here of a very classic type of complementary community network is the NGO called Altamundi in Argentina. One of our members who is supporting a wide range of small urban areas in the state of Cordoba to address their connectivity issues, which range from patchy broadband signal to unaffordable mobile broadband costs. So you can see there on the left, they clubbed together and erected a very tall mast on a friendly farmer's land there, and they also made a negotiation, and this is an important aspect, with a nearby university. So I think the partnerships don't just come from between the private sector and the public sector, but also with the academic and research sector and civil society. So they are able to actually access virtually unlimited bandwidth in the off-peak period where the university doesn't use it, and they have a more limited supply of bandwidth during peak hours. But this means that they actually don't pay anything at all for their connectivity. Each household clubs together and pays for their own router and is trained on how to install it to connect to the network. And that's the setup cost of around $100. And then they put away about $5 a month to as kind of an insurance policy to pay for a likely replacement of any hardware equipment that might fail over the course of a few years, so that they have a reserve there. And you can see a couple of links to the organization. And also they've, interestingly enough, designed a wireless router that's specifically got features that is, makes it particularly amenable to this kind of environment with varying voltage, solar power requirements, hardened against lightning, etc. So moving on to the next slide, please. A less common example, but that we found particularly interesting, is a completely independent mobile GSM-based network in Mexico. Our member Rhizomatica there has been supporting a federation of small indigenous communities to set up their own mobile networks. So this is completely independent of the national mobile networks, and this is a courtesy of some progressive legislation in Mexico that allowed indigenous groups and less well-covered areas to obtain their own mobile spectrum. And this is something we haven't really seen widely adopted anywhere else in the world yet, although there are a number of trials in Colombia and South Africa, in the DRC, and a number of other countries. So I'm expecting that this kind of model will grow rapidly, because the cost of mobile equipment has come down so much now that you can actually set up the entire network, including a significant mast, for about $10,000. Even less if you don't need to have a particularly high site, and you can you have access to, say, the premises of the municipal authorities, which is the case here in Mexico, in Oaxaca, where these networks are being established. So we've seen more than 14 now established in covering 60 different municipal areas, and they have unlimited access to the network for local calls at no cost, for which they pay around $2.50 a month as a flat fee. And this also gives them incoming calls from other parts of Mexico, and then they pay a kind of standard, in fact, cheaper rate than a mobile network call, using voice over IP to connect back into the other operator networks in Mexico. So here, I think the key area is the access to spectrum that has allowed them to do this. So just to finish up with a couple of key observations, my last slide here. What we've also noticed with these complementary networks is that many have the aspiration to involve women. So there's a higher involvement of women in the network, whether it's through just setting up the deployment, or even in many cases, fortunately, we've actually had women technicians trained to support these networks. And in fact, Digital Empowerment Foundation in India has pioneered this with a number of initiatives for the barefoot women in Wi-Fi installers. So another aspect, of course, is that many people don't have the full access devices. They can't afford a computer with the rich interface that it provides, and they're restricted to the small screens of their mobile phones. And in some cases, even these, they cannot afford a smartphone. So we often see that public access is often included as part of the initiative to make sure that even people who can't afford basic access devices can still benefit from the connectivity. We've also seen strong synergies with community radio initiatives, because they often have very similar goals in terms of increasing access to information for the public. And they also may even have the facilities that can easily allow community network to bolt on to the community radio mast, for example, the uninterruptible energy supply that may already be in place to maintain the FM broadcasting facilities. Again, this really depends a lot on the openness of the regulatory environment in terms of allowing community radios to flourish. So I think that brings me to the key point, is that these complementary networks are primarily limited by the lack of the enabling regulatory environment, be it spectrum or the high cost of backhaul because there's no infrastructure sharing requirements, or many of the other aspects in relation to internet service provision, where licensing environments are designed for large national mobile operators and other national commercial operators that have very different needs and expectations from their networks. And then, of course, not to forget about the human capacity lack of, which is very prevalent in rural areas because of the brain drain mainly, and the lack of opportunities in rural areas. So the human capacity is the other concern that I would like to make people aware of, that constant training needs to take place to ensure that the capacity is there for these networks to flourish. And just to end, I'd like to say that this rural broadband framework isn't something you can really pick and choose from. It's an ecosystem approach where you have to really pick up all of the points that Natalia mentioned if you really want to have a successful rural connectivity strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I really like the fact that you ended on that note, because it's important to stress that we cannot have two kinds of connectivity, one for rural areas and one for urban. We have to make sure that the kind of quality that we are expecting for urban areas is also top-notch for the rural areas. And I was particularly excited to see the pictures of the ladies working on the community networks. I think I saw a similar one of the slides in Osama's presentation as well. It's very encouraging that we continue to empower and give women the opportunity to also work in this space. And then, of course, in a lot of rural areas, some of the households have women-led households. So the more we get involved in that space, the better it is for connectivity in those rural areas. And of course, as you also stressed on the importance of regulatory environment, and it's one that keeps coming through a lot. And clearly, this framework is just a start in guiding what kind of regulations or licensing needs to be looked at if we really want to expand connectivity to rural areas. So it's great to hear these perspectives and to see the examples from Latin America. But I wonder what the examples would be from Africa as well. And it's very exciting to have Lillian from CIPESA with us. Lillian is going to speak to us how this framework can be applied in Africa, and then also some of the key learnings from her line of work. Lillian.
Thanks, Elena, and thanks to the WSIS forum for enabling us to be able to connect despite the current times. As already has been mentioned, the current pandemic has it has not only given us a chance to really push for, equal access, or if there's a term I want to coin is even access, but it has showed us that now more than ever, we need to have better access for everyone, not just for a few people in urban areas. But just a little bit more about CPES. CPES, as you've already heard, works around promoting effective use of ICT policies for, advancement of, general living or human rights and livelihoods. And for me and for us, this framework does not only provide, it's not just a piece of paper that we would like to present to say regulators and say this is what needs to be done, but it's a piece of framework that we can benchmark and look at the different aspects. It's a good thing that we've heard from Asia and Latin America how, community networks are helping, reach, the unconnected. In Africa, whereas CPES has not really been actively engaged in implementing community networks, but we've been involved in policy advocacy where, I'll just give an example, just recently here in Uganda, we had a new licensing framework for telecoms, which became effective first July this month. This year. And this framework, when we look at the Rural Broadband Framework, and you look at I think it's the framework on streamlining regulatory processes, we are saying that our government is trying to find the best way, in which it can create competition and, equitable, licensing framework for different categories of, service providers. I know, and the beauty is, I think I would like to say Uganda has been one of the first countries to create a community network license. And this is, a plus that we can look at as people, who are working around promoting equitable access, that we can leverage on and push for other African countries also to be able to adopt something that's similar to what Uganda is doing. And the other thing that when I look at this framework and try to bring it back home to the work that we do, we've seen that, yes, we do need access in rural areas, but again, there are barriers that, relate to taxes, taxations and fee structure. I know in our new licensing framework in the Ugandan context, there's been some, easing on this licensing. But again, when we look away from just, the licensing regime that we are looking at, there are other impending kind of taxation policies that can further hinder, the enjoyment of broadband in rural areas. Just to throw some work on this is, of course, I know we keep saying this, but I mean, the story never gets old. Uganda is one of those first countries that introduced a tax on, on social media users. When you bring it, already we are having challenges with people in urban areas accessing, equitable, broadband. But when you take it to the rural areas where people are supposed to kind of find an alternative to accessing internet, and then you find this additional tax, it creates the cost of, accessing the internet more higher, and they become, more disconnected. So what we've been doing is we've trying to push for this and see how it can be removed. And just about recently, we've seen pushes from, of course, from the world, from the FOIA, and we've also seen a push from the World Bank to see how we can reduce this taxation, in the digital economy. So for me, this framework provides an opportunity for us as CSOs to find a ways of engaging not just the, the telecoms, but also the government and also other CSOs gathering around promoting equitable access to rural broadband. And it's not just about actually just broadband, but also it has underlying issues on how this broadband can be made more meaningful for, for the telecoms to be able to provide that last mile. So Eliana, I think that's all I can provide for now, and I'm happy to pick on any further questions.
Thank you, Lillian, and I'm glad you brought in the conversation about fiscal issues and especially taxation. We all know that taxation is not gender neutral, that it impacts women more negatively than men, and we're very proud of the work we did with CIPESA on this matter when we looked at various countries in Eastern Africa who had imposed taxes on social media and how that impacted women more negatively because they often had to rely on, close user groups, WhatsApp, and so suddenly they found themselves outpriced by the wave of taxes. So I will encourage everyone who hasn't seen this report. It's called Who Wins, Who Loses, and it looks at the impact of social media on taxation in Eastern Africa. And I also think that it's important to stress on digital economy and how, if we are really going to develop a digital economy, we cannot do it without developing the rural broadband space as well. So it all ties everything all together. So this is the time where we come to our participants and see what they've been saying. There are a couple of comments in the chat box, and but I think I think Teram Muluk was saying that he thinks that effective usage of universal service funds is also very important to bring high-speed broadband connectivity in rural areas. It's more like a comment, but I'm wondering if anyone wants to add anything to this. Mike, is this, what do you think?
Well, as I kind of alluded to in my closing remarks, I hesitate to focus on any one particular factor because we really need to address all of these issues in unison. And what I think is particularly valuable about the Rural Broadband Connectivity Framework is that it focuses the mind on, 8 particular objectives there. It's so easy to kind of try and have a bag that covers every single possible eventuality, and one can get overloaded with all the different factors. So I think distilling it down into these eight particular areas of focus is a very good step towards focusing regulatory minds on the key issues and also the policymakers.
Okay, and there's another. It's some of these are more like quotients, so it's like a question and a comment together. This one of the key human capacity problems we faced with rural telecenter rollout in South Africa was that a trained telecenter manager immediately became marketable and was able to leave their rural home for a better paid urban job. So, how do you stop the brain drain? I think that's what they're trying to say. How do you stop the brain drain? Anyone wants to take this up, Lillian or Osama?
Lillian, you go first. Yeah.
No, you go first because I was kind of distracted and I was trying to look for the comments online in the chat, but you can go ahead, you can take it, Osama.
Yeah, Eleanor, can you rephrase the question once again, please?
The question is about how to stop the brain drain from telecenters. So once you train people for telecenters in a rural area, once they become marketable, they like to move away from those centers. So how do you get them to stay or remain in the rural areas to address the issue about capacity and demand?
So it's very fortunate that your question is very timely. Actually, Digital Empowerment Foundation is actually doing a case study on one of the telecenter operators. telecenter here, I am not really using it as a brand the way telecenter used to be known many, many years ago. But I am using it more from the perspective of the village level digital entrepreneur. So this person who lives in a tribal areas in Maharashtra was trained by us many, many years back in running a telecenter, and he ran comfortably and successfully the telecenters, gradually converted the telecenters into providing government services. And then one day about 7 years back, he was trained by us by for community networks. And when BharatNet, somebody is asking a question which I'll reply later, but BharatNet is a government initiative to connect rural India's village councils with 100 Mbps fiber optic broadband. And in his area, when it was reached, he was chosen by BharatNet to take the fiber and take it to the other institutions in the village area. Now this guy earns monthly $2,000 in a village, and I don't think anybody can earn $2,000 even leaving the village and coming to the city. So I mean, it's a great example of how in this case digital might be actually helping in reversing the brain drain rather than creating a brain drain that once the person is running telecenter and leave and go to the city, because COVID has actually also created a reverse migration. You know, many people have started going back to the villages. So I'm not giving number. I'm not saying that this is not going to be done, but I doubt that if we are going to create a very good digital entrepreneurship model at the village level, rural broadband can give them an additional input or a reason to become more successful entrepreneur if the market helps entrepreneurship. If the market opens up to provide backhaul easily. You know, it is very, very important, I'm reiterating, that village level connectivity of broadband in a fast-paced ways is not possible without creating entrepreneurship or distribution of backhaul at a larger number to distribute the network to the people. Otherwise, it is very, very cost intensive. The only way you can distribute the infrastructural cost is by creating entrepreneurship and open it up.
Right. That's a very good point about incentives, ensuring incentives at the local level. There's also comments here. We had a lot more comments about including, making sure that we include physically challenged people, people with persons with disabilities as well. That's coming from Dr. Kweku Fosu-Adakwa. And so I think that's a point about inclusion that and I believe that is being captured in the policy framework. And then finally, the question is about, there was another question that rural broadband, they take it that rural broadband is 3G and above. Ideally, we want it to be what is in the meaningful connectivity standard, which is a 4G type speed. So anything that is above 10 megabits per second for download is what we'll be considering for this. So, I mean, we are almost, we've got about less than 2 minutes to the top of the hour. When we'll be signing off. I just wanted to find out from the rest of the panel, so if there's one thing that you want policymakers to take out of this rural broadband policy framework, what would it be? And so what would your elevator pitch be? So I think we would start with you, Mike, and then we'll go through the panel. What will be your elevator pitch in less than 30 seconds on how they can make use of this framework?
Thanks, Eleanor. I think you probably heard me beat the drum enough about this integrated approach where you cover all the bases. But just one extra point is also think beyond purely the telecom sector, the leverage that can be gained from other areas. Interesting initiative called the Smart Villages Initiative in Niger, where the ITU and the World Bank and a number of other organizations, including the FAO, are supporting this integrated approach, which not only builds better supply, it builds better demand. And one of the aspects that we always forget about is electricity supply, which kind of falls outside the telecom supply, but we can't use these electronic devices without good electricity. So don't forget about that too. Thanks.
Thank you. Natalia?
My elevator pitch is, hello, policymakers and regulators. Broadband in rural areas, the problem won't be solved if we don't have specific targeted measures. We need specific measures to make this work because it hasn't worked yet. And you can have specific measures for rural areas. Take a look at the framework. It's an initial, there are initial guidelines that can be applied to any country. And we need to pay attention to that specifically now that this has become clearer to everyone, that the gap exists and won't be solved if we don't have targeted actions and measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Osama, your elevator pitch?
Yeah, so I would say that for the rural broadband connectivity, we should declare that each country will have, like the way you have right to food, right to information, you should have right to broadband as a part of the constitution and your democratic practices, and it should be implemented as it is written in constitution.
Wonderful. And finally, but not least, Lillian, what would your elevator pitch be to policymakers?
For me, it's about monitoring, reevaluating, ensuring that everyone is connected. It's not just about, putting the broadband there, but it has to be a much more holistic approach. So for us to have meaningful connectivity across all spectrums, there has to be continuous measuring, evaluating, and ensuring that, everyone is, skilled at to use this connectivity broadband that we are pushing for.
Thank you. And thank you so much all to my panel, Michael, Natalia, Osama, Lillian, and Michael, who is working behind the scenes. We hope that you found this session very useful. You can find more on our website that's been put in the comments or just Google Rural Broadband Policy Framework. We have a dedicated website with all the case studies that continue to evolve as we look at the application of this framework. It's a living document, it's a living framework, and it's a very holistic one. And we hope that we can have a more developed conversation about this in the next few years of how this has helped countries to be able to connect their citizens in the rural areas. So thank you, WSIS, for giving us this opportunity, and we continue to have these conversations as we move along. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.